President, history is a great teacher if you learn your history. And the history of the United States when it comes to refugees is a checkered history. Back during World War II, there were people who came to the borders of the United States and begged for our mercy, begged for our help. 900 of them were on a ship called the SS St. Louis. They were Jews who came from Europe seeking refuge in the United States from the Nazis. Sadly, the United States turned them away. Several hundred of them were forced back to Europe and died in the Holocaust. On the floor of this United States Senate, a Democratic senator from New York, Robert Wagner, offered a measure to allow 10,000 children, Jewish children, to come to the United States during World War II and escape the possibility of imprisonment and death during World War II and the Holocaust. That measure was defeated here on the floor of the United States Senate. Those children were denied refuge in the United States. Toward the end of the war, things started changing. Our policies became more open. We started accepting more people, but the record had been written. And during the darkest days of World War II, the United States virtually closed its borders to those who were trying to escape Nazi terror. After World War II, we decided that we were wrong, that we had made a mistake, and that the United States would demonstrate to the world that we did care about those who came to the United States as refugees and those who came from other countries seeking asylum. We wrote an amazing history after World War II. When you think of the many different nations that turned to us when they faced the worst circumstances imaginable, you think about what happened in the United States. The Cuban population escaping communism in Cuba. Where did they come? They came here. And you can still find them. You can find them all over the United States, but especially in Florida, near Miami, in New Jersey, but everywhere. And the Cuban Americans have made an amazing contribution to this country. They came as refugees, but they became real Americans. And they love this country. In fact, so much so that I believe 3 of our members of the United States Senate are Cuban Americans today. That's quite a story. But it's not the only story about refugees coming to this country. You could add to that litany of people who came, the Vietnamese after the end of the war in Vietnam, the Soviet Jews who escaped persecution in Russia to come to the United States. The list is long. It includes refugees from all over the world who came to this country. Now, we just don't open our doors and say, walk in and make yourself at home. We ask questions. We do background checks. We do everything we can to be sure that the person coming is the person they say they are and that they will be safe for the United States. But over the years, the number of refugees we accepted on an annual basis went up to 80,000, 100,000. And the United States developed an international reputation, a reputation for caring for people who were in the worst circumstances, who came here looking for refuge. I run into refugees and their families and their children and their grandchildren every single day. They've made a great contribution to our country, and we have made a great model for the world when it comes to accepting people who are in the worst, most terrifying circumstances. Mr. President, that is about to change. We are in the process now of facing the worst refugee crisis in the history of the world in so many different places. And the United States, instead of maintaining this image and this model of accepting refugees from other countries, under this president, President Donald Trump, has decided to do just the opposite. Not only to cut in half the number of refugees we would clear, review, interrogate, and accept in the United States each year to 50,000 is the official number, but in actuality, only about 18,000 have been accepted so far in the first few months of this year. It's an indication we won't even reach 50,000. But there's something going on as well when it comes to those who seek asylum or refuge in this country that is equally horrifying and objectionable. the Trump administration has decided to discourage those who would come to our borders looking for safety by telling mothers who bring their infants and children that those children will be taken away from them by the government of the United States when they arrive at our border. It's hard to imagine, but that is the stated policy now of the Trump administration. It is a cruel policy. It is not a policy consistent with American values. Since our nation's tragic failure during World War II to help Jewish refugees fleeing Adolf Hitler, generations of Americans have tried to set an example for the world by providing a safe haven to the world's most vulnerable people. Now, facing the worst refugee crisis in the history of the world, with more than 65 million people around the world displaced from their homes, the Trump administration is admitting the fewest refugees since World War II and going to extreme lengths to prevent victims of war and terrorism from seeking asylum in the United States. So far this year, about 15,000 unaccompanied children have been apprehended at our southwest border. This is not necessarily a crisis in a nation of 325 million people, especially at a time when we're asking friendly nations, our allies in the Middle East, to do much more in accepting refugees. The real crisis that gives cause to people showing up at our southern border asking for asylum can be traced to three countries: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the so-called Northern Triangle. These countries in Central America have among the highest homicide rates in the world. Girls, basically young girls, face a constant threat of sexual violence with little or no protection. That's why families are doing desperate things, taking extraordinary risks to come to our border and ask for protection. Is there any parent who would not do the same to save their child? How has the Trump administration responded to this refugee crisis on our border? They are trying to discourage families from fleeing to our borders by separating parents from their children. In March, we learned in my office in Chicago about a 7-year-old girl and her mother who came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've been there. It's a land of terrible massacres, barbarism. It's a land of violence. The Democratic Republic of Congo had these two, a mother and daughter, come to our shores, and they were separated for 4 months, a 7-year-old girl from her mother. I asked the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General to investigate this. Why would we separate a 7-year-old girl from her mom who was coming from the Congo seeking protection? Well, at the time, the Trump administration said, we don't separate families. That was the official statement at the time. But last month, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that the separation of children from their parents was a new, quote, zero-tolerance approach. And now, family separation has become the official policy of the government of the United States of America. In just the first 2 weeks of this policy, under Attorney General Sessions, 658 children have been separated from their parents. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly says separating families is, quote, a tough deterrent to parents who are fleeing persecution. And he dismissed any concerns because, quote, the children will be taken care of. We'll put them into foster care or whatever, John Kelly said. Well, our nation's leading medical experts disagree. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association have condemned this official policy of the Trump administration separating families in immigration detention. Here's what the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics said, and I quote, "Separating children from their parents contradicts everything we stand for as pediatricians, protecting and promoting children's health. In fact, highly stressful experiences like family separation can cause irreparable harm, disrupting a child's brain architecture and affecting his or her short and long-term health. This type of prolonged exposure to serious stress, known as toxic stress, can carry lifelong consequences for these children." Trump administration has been taking some heat, deservedly, for separating families. In typical fashion, no surprise, they've decided the real cause of the problem would be the Democrats. Just this morning, President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "Separating families at the border is the fault of bad legislation passed by the Democrats," our president tweeted. But the law he's talking about wasn't passed by the Democrats. It is the bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which was passed by unanimous consent in the Senate and was signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. President Trump has his facts wrong again. This law has nothing to do with the separation of families. Instead, it ensures the United States meets its international obligations to protect unaccompanied children seeking safe haven in our country. It was a response to concerns by Republicans and Democrats that children apprehended by the Border Patrol were being returned to countries where they might be further persecuted or killed. Under this law, unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle countries I mentioned earlier are transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services and placed in deportation proceedings, giving them a chance to make their case to a judge as to why they're seeking protection in America. Consider Samuel and Amelie, siblings aged 3 and 6 from Honduras. 3 and 6. When they arrived in the United States, they were traumatized and refused to speak. After months of counseling, Amelie revealed that both children had been raped by drug cartel members. Without the protection of this law, which the President condemned this morning, these children would have been returned to Honduras in almost certain exploitation or death. 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing on unaccompanied children in the Senate Immigration Subcommittee, which I serve on as a ranking member. We examined the administration's claim that the law the President objects to is being exploited by gangs. Here is what we learned. Unaccompanied children undergo multiple screenings and background checks when they present themselves at the border. And the law gives the government the authority to place any unaccompanied child in a secure facility if there is any notion of a threat. Since the year 2012, 6 years ago, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has processed more than 250,000 unaccompanied children. Of those, how many were confirmed or suspected of affiliation with the MS-13 gang that the President talks about nonstop? 60. 60 out of 250,000. 60 over 6 years. 10 a year. Fewer than 1 a month. And the President says we have to separate these kids because of drug gang worries. I don't want a single member of any gang anywhere admitted into this country, period. End of quote. But for goodness sakes, 250,000 children and 60 over a 6-year period were confirmed or suspected of affiliation with MS-13. Instead of stoking fears, we should focus on preventing unaccompanied children from being recruited by gangs. Sadly, the Trump administration's budget is slashing funding for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the government agency that's responsible for these important gang prevention efforts. At our hearing, we also discussed the conditions in the Northern Triangle countries in Central America that are driving families to flee to our border. If people were migrating because of the so-called legal loopholes, which we hear so often about from this administration, they wouldn't be just coming from 3 countries, they'd be coming from all over the region. But we learned that more than 90% of the unaccompanied kids referred to the Department of Health and Human Services are from 3 nations, the 3 of the Northern Triangle. So instead of addressing the root causes that are driving migration from these countries, the Trump administration is making the situation on the ground worse. The administration's budget request for the region would slash aid by more than 1/3. And the administration is terminating the temporary protected status for 2 of these countries, El Salvador and Honduras, forcing many people to return to them, even though these countries are clearly unstable. Last year, the administration also ended the Central American Minor Program, which permitted children from the Northern Triangle to apply for refugee resettlement from their home country. We said, don't make this dangerous journey. Mothers with their babies and their infants, don't make this dangerous journey. If you are in danger in your home country and want to seek asylum or refuge in the United States, make the application from where you are before you have to make that journey. That would unfortunately come to an end with the administration's request to stop funding the program. Mr. President, there are many issues that come before the American people, but few that have stoked the emotions of this issue. The notion that the United States of America, over 300 million good and caring people, would make it an official policy to separate these infants and toddlers and children from their mothers and parents is not American. It's extreme, it's mean, and it's cruel. Sadly, it's the official policy, the so-called zero tolerance policy that's been announced by Attorney General Sessions. We learned a bitter lesson back in World War II. We ignored the realities of human suffering, and people across the world asked, what is going on in America? What are their values? After that war, we tried to make it clear what we do stand for, the things that are clearly important. And now this administration has decided we can no longer afford to do that. We have to separate children from their mothers, separate them by thousands of miles, put them into foster care, remove them from their mothers, even if that mother, even if that parent qualifies for protection here in the United States under our laws of asylum. This is a sad and cruel policy. I hope Americans across the board will stand up and speak up. We're a better nation than this.